Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's office hours. We'll just give it 1 minute for everybody to come online here. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's ESG-CV office hours. My name is Natalie Metzger-Smith. I am a technical assistance provider working on behalf of TAC. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy day today to learn more about and get updates about the ESG-CV program. All right, next slide, thank you. As always, we are going to have the slide deck and a copy of the chat and Q&A sent out to all of you within the next few days. There is an archive, as many of you know, on the HUD Exchange that has all of our previous office hours recordings. There is a small lag on posting those just because we have to convert them to make sure they're 508 compliant and everything else. And so I believe that the December recording and materials have been posted, and we are going to have the January materials and the recording posted soon. I know all of you are very familiar with Zoom, but however, if you do have any issues, we do have Laura Harris here, who is our tech support and is available by chat if any issues arise during this presentation. Next slide. So just want to start off with some announcements. There is a HUD office hours this Friday. The topic for those office hours on Friday is going to be Tarrant County, Texas. They're going to be sharing with us how they've been able to utilize or increase utilization of their emergency housing vouchers. And then we're also going to learn more about IRS outreach efforts surrounding the enhanced child and earned income tax credits. The NAEH virtual unsheltered homeless conference is happening now. So hopefully some of you have been able to attend some of those workshops. And then what is ongoing as well is the Rapid Rehousing Roundtable. It's a series of webinars that have been going on for the last month or so. The next one is scheduled for February 22nd. And the purpose of the roundtable is to identify and expand on best practices to support innovation in rapid rehousing. This roundtable is intended for anyone who is involved in your homelessness response. The next one is February 22nd, and the topic is rapid resolution and rapid exit. And on March 1st, the following webinar, the topic is going to be innovation and rapid rehousing. And then finally, in May, the National Healthcare for the Homeless Conference is going to happen, which is pretty exciting. I think it actually might even be in person in Bellingham, Washington. So something to keep in mind. Next slide. All right. There have been a flurry of HUD products that have been published in the last week or two, which is exciting. And I wanted to bring them to your attention. The first one is about shelter renovation. And what this product does is it helps explain to how communities can utilize ESG-CV to renovate shelters to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID. It dives into detail on how to assess what your needs are and what other funding and resources you may want to incorporate, and examples of what types of shelter renovations are eligible using ESG-CV funds. And then another product was published. It's on how you can identify sources of operating funds for your housing programs. So it provides examples of eligible ESG-CV operating costs and what other funding sources are available to pay for operating costs. It also includes community examples of how agencies were able to braid their local, state, and federal funding sources was to fund the operating costs for their housing programs. And then finally, many of you may have already seen this, but there was a new product published that's solely dedicated to purchasing furniture with ESG-CV funds. I really love this product. It clearly outlines when you would have to reimburse HUD for furniture's purchase with ESG-CV. And it also details that if you do purchase furniture with ESG-CV funds, what elements need to be included in your written standards and what the record keeping requirements are. Next slide. And then here, just wanted to highlight a few resources out there that I'm excited about and that I know a lot of other people are as well. The first is a voting guide that was published by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And this helps Americans to exercise their right to vote if they are homeless or if they're a homelessness provider. It is in 5 different languages, and it has like an election checklist for homeless services providers and a voting checklist for people experiencing homelessness. Couple of things I found interesting with that resource was that I didn't realize that less than 10% of people vote while they're homeless, even though 60% of the population was eligible to vote. And you don't need a permanent address in order to be able to vote, which I thought is really cool. Also, I wanted to remind you, many of you may already have this, but last month, there was a monitoring workshop presented at the CARES Act conference. That recording and the PDF of the PowerPoint is available. So if you click on that link, you'll be able to access that. And then finally, SAMHSA published a really great resource on how you can help people obtain ID documents. It's a toolkit, so it provides like what types of ID documents are needed, how to replace them if they're lost, what are the estimated costs and fee waivers, and what are some best practices for ID replacement. I think this is really helpful, especially if you're trying to get IDs for people you're working with, and maybe some of that paperwork you're submitting is getting sent back to you because it's filled out incorrectly or it's missing some information. I know there's a lot of frustration out there when that happens, so I think this toolkit would be really helpful for you. Next slide. So today's agenda is we're going to focus first on ESG-CV spending strategies. How do the changes to that 80% deadline impact your spending strategies? Like, what are your concerns? So I'm going to facilitate a discussion where we can share ideas, our concerns, what resources do you need so we can best support you in those next 6 months. And then I'm going to go into some eligible ESG-CV prepayment costs that you can explore. And then Missouri is going to share with us some of their strategies that have helped them become so successful in spending out their funds. Missouri is amazing. They are I think #1 in the country for ESG-CV spending. And so Aiden Rich, the HUD program supervisor from the Missouri Housing Development Commission, is going to share some of their strategies. Just one more thing before we get going, wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and that we will send a PowerPoint and all the materials out soon after this session. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. However, you are also welcome if you want to come off mute and ask a question. We would love that. Just raise your hand, and then Laura Harris, our tech support, can take you off mute to ask the question. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that you have. We're definitely taking notes on your needs, and if we aren't able to answer any of your questions, we'll be sure to do our research and get back to you. Next slide. All right. First, we want to just provide you with a brief update on the changes to the HUD spending timelines. Next slide. As many of you know, that 80% deadline to expend your ESG-CV funds by March 31st, 2022 has been waived. HUD is evaluating whether or not they want whether or not those deadlines are going to be further changed with the September 30th, 2022 deadline. We do, however, really urge you to operate as business as usual because, like I said, HUD may implement another spending deadline. As we all know, September 30th is right around the corner and is going to come sooner than you think. So we really urge you to just stay vigilant and keep on implementing your programs and to not change your strategies. We really want to emphasize we really don't want you to move money around just to spend down your ESG-CV funds. We're hearing of grantees who are moving large sums of money out of the rapid rehousing into other components just to spend it. And really the intent of changing that 80% deadline was to ensure that grantees aren't making spending decisions that doesn't impact the reduction of homelessness in your communities. So really just want to emphasize that and urge you just to kind of keep that strategy in place that you had previously and not to panic and to start spending money just to spend money. Next slide. We do have a poll because we are so curious about how that 80% deadline is, the removal of that deadline is impacting your spending strategies. And so if you could just take a second to answer this poll, the question is, how does the change in the 80% deadline impact your spending? It either does not change your strategy, you're moving forward with your original spending plan. It does not change your strategy. You're still planning to shift funds into homelessness prevention and shelter to spend funds more quickly. Maybe it did change your strategy. You plan to move funds to other components, but no longer. Or maybe your agency is still collecting information and evaluating whether or not to make any changes, or you simply don't know. All right. Okay, so it looks like for most of you, your agency is still collecting information and evaluating whether to make any changes. That's really helpful to know. And then it doesn't change your strategy. You're still moving forward with your original spending plan. For some of you, you're not quite sure. And then it looks like for the minority, it doesn't change your strategy. You're still shifting funds to homelessness prevention and shelter. And then it did change strategy. Okay, all right. So it still seems like it might be early in the game to kind of determine whether or not that is going to be something that is going to impact you long term. I do want to have a discussion about it. And Laura, if you don't mind exiting out of the shared screen. Awesome. We do have some discussion questions today because I think we're just super curious about like how things have changed and what we can do to support you going forward. I do want this to be an interactive discussion. We're just going to talk for maybe about 10 or 15 minutes. If you do want to contribute, which I really urge you to, all you have to do is raise your hand and Laura will take you off mute. And so my first question to you all is that how does no longer having the March spending deadline allow you to use the ESG funding to help people currently homeless? does this just kind of give you some breathing room? Are you able to explore maybe some of those strategies that you had set aside prior to learning about the change in the deadline? Jessica has said that it's not really changing your strategy, but it has taken away the extra burden for your subrecipients. Many subs were finally getting into the swing of implementing all of the program changes and spending large amounts of money. But now you no longer have to worry about the funds being taken away if you don't meet the 80% deadline. Our subs are much more comfortable with the spending. That is fantastic. I think that's the case for a lot of people. What are you communicating to your subrecipients about this deadline? Because for so long, we were pushing, and then it's changed a bit. Are you still pushing, saying our internal goal is still 80%? Did you set up internal goals to have those spending milestones in place? And if so, did you switch those? How are things on the ground there where you're working?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. We've always had spending deadlines within our ESG contracts, all of them, and we kept that with ESG-CV. We require them to spend a certain amount per 6 months, at 9 months, and at the end of the grant. So we're holding them to that because it is internally going to keep them on the spending to get 100% expended by the end of September. So with that, the biggest, it's a lot of work to do all of these changes. And it takes a while to get our subrecipients on board and to get them to expend in new ways that they hadn't before, and to get comfortable with that and follow all the regulations that come with that, update their policy and procedure. And now they're finally doing that. And so we're very confident that we're going to be able to expend 100% by the end of September without the burden of, oh, they're going to take away money if we don't reach the 80% mark in March, which I thought was a lot anyways, because then that doesn't leave but 20% to expend by the end of September. That wasn't very feasible for us. So it has been a great relief, and it has been very helpful. And we're still holding them to our internal spending deadlines.
Do you mind, if you know what those are, do you mind sharing what your internal spending deadlines are?
Yes, absolutely. So we actually broke we had ESG-CV 1 and ESG-CV 2 because there were 2 rounds. We broke them out into 2 grants. They're supposed to be 1 year each. The first round ended up being a 14-month grant. Our last one is basically a 12-month grant for ESG-CV 2. At 6 months, they're required to spend 50% of their total grant. At 9 months, they're required to spend 75%. And by the end, they have to spend 100%. And we're very aggressive anyways. At month 6, if they haven't, they're required to give us a spending plan. And many times we let them pass with that because we can see what they have. If they haven't reached their 75% goal at 9 months, we are way more aggressive. And with their spending plan, they have to show us obligated expenses. They have to provide as much proof as they can that they're going to be able to expend 100%. If they do not, we have a team that meets and will take away everything but what they have obligated through the end of the grant and give it to our other subs that are expending way more or have run out of funds.
That's super helpful. Jessica, what state are you from?
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Marshall from Michigan said that it does give you more space to be strategic. You also have modified spending goals. So spending stays on track. I think having those internal spending goals are obviously key, and that those really haven't changed, even though the HUD timeline and the spending milestones have changed, which I find really interesting. Have you modified your internal spending milestones given the change in the HUD ones? Juliana said that their internal goal is still 80%. Okay, so they haven't changed their internal goal, and half their subrecipients already hit that goal, which is awesome. A few subrecipients have taken longer, so it does take the pressure off those. and they're going to completely spin out their funds by the September deadline, which is fantastic. Have any of you changed your internal spending milestones, or is this just it's great information that HUD's been able to have, but internally nothing really has changed? Are any of you getting spending related questions from subrecipients that are bubbling up that you wish to share with others? Any concerns that you're hearing? Hey, Joe.
Hello. Hi everyone. Joe Hightower from the Idaho Balance Estate. I'd like to just this might echo a lot of people, but there's kind of always been an issue with getting a lot of the subrecipients to spend down on rapid rehousing.
Mhm.
And so when there was the threshold deadline in March, I was kind of reconfiguring a lot of the budgets, and I had started pulling a lot of the rapid rehousing funds from those budgets and kind of recapturing that and reallocating where it was needed the most. So
Mhm.
a lot of those funds were going into more of like the shelter component, some homelessness prevention, but mainly to shelter. And currently we're now nearly at 50% of spending. So I'm kind of anticipating by September that we'll have almost spent 100% of the funds. We have some projects in place, one renovation project, and also a potential property acquisition. And if that goes through, then we should be nearly 100% by the end of September. And so now I'm trying to reconfigure. There's still there's a huge need in the shelter component, especially for non-congregate shelters or hotel motels.
Mhm.
And so I'm still trying to reevaluate that and pull some of the rapid rehousing funds from some of the underspenders. So that's kind of my dilemma. And we're trying to, approach the business as usual now. But at the same time, there's such slow spending in the rapid rehousing component that it's really difficult to leave those funds there.
Right. It is. It is hard, especially when the need is so great in other places. Definitely. So are you moving some funds back into rapid rehousing now that the deadline has changed, or are you just continuing on that, the
Yeah,
strategy shift?
kind of focusing on the strategy shift because of like I said, the shelter need is really abundant still.
Mhm.
We're getting a lot of requests that are coming in for that, especially locally here in Boise, for one of the hotel motels that we've been working with pretty heavily, and they have a contract through June, and they need like another 200,000 projection through June.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I don't really anticipate adding to any more rapid rehousing to any of the budgets across the board. In
Okay.
fact, I think I'll probably have to recapture more. But
That's good to hear.
I think it'd be nice if the spending increased, but I don't see that here at least in our state.
Do you think that if HUD did change that September 30th deadline, that you would continue to push rapid rehousing, knowing you have that longer runway?
So beyond the September 30th deadline,
Yeah. Mhm.
potentially, but I mean, I'm sure a
Yeah.
lot of other states can relate, but we have such a severe housing crisis, and rents just continue to increase.
Yeah.
The rent reasonableness, waiver that does help, but there's still a shortage, and landlords continue to raise the rents, and so a lot of our subrecipients are just continuing to struggle, no matter where they're
Yep.
located.
Yep. Yep. That makes sense. Yeah, that's what we're hearing all across the
Yeah,
country, unfortunately. Yeah.
it is unfortunate.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Appreciate you sharing.
Of course.
Amber said one new rapid rehousing spending challenge that they've heard as of late is that it's more difficult than other to find landlords, cooperative landlords, because many of our state's smaller mom and pop landlords have sold their properties and gotten out of the business in recent months, given the upheaval due to COVID. And then Jessica stated that the only worry they have now is that HUD will decide to extend the September deadline so late in the game, say 3 months before September, that they will have spent all their ESG-CV funds. Any word on how HUD intends to reallocate unspent ESG-CV funds, or is that too early to get an answer to the question? Yes, I think that's a really great question. I know HUD is working on it. That's one of the things that they're addressing. Unfortunately, the extension of the September 30th deadline, we're only going to hear about through a notice. And so HUD is really focused on that right now. And as you all know, it does take some time to get a notice to be released. But the idea is that we'll hopefully hear in the next month or so on the status of that, because I think HUD does recognize that, you know, extending that deadline, you know, so late in the game, you know, like May or June, it's too late for most of us, especially if we're trying to place people in rapid rehousing and have leases and that need long-term support. So I know HUD's working to get that information out as soon as possible.
Natalie, do we want to see William? I'm not sure if you have any representing HUD, any other context you wanted to share on that.
No, it's a great question. Natalie really covered it quite well. Like, that's something we're definitely aware of. Believe it or not, we've been working on a notice, especially associated with the September 30th reallocation information from last September 30th. And we've been working on that for months, like it takes that long. I would anticipate that there will be a notice that clarifies what will happen with regard to that September 30th, 2021 piece, right? That reallocation of some funds associated with that. If there's going to be an extension to the overall deadline, it will likely be in that same notice. So I will just tell you, you may be in one of those camps where you're like, we covered our 20% deadline. We're good. I don't need to worry about that notice. And I would tell you, you should read the notice, if for no other reason than to see, like, is there an extension deadline in that notice? So that's the only other thing I would add.
All right, good information. Thanks, William. All right. Just last question. Is there any resources that you need from us to support you? I know rapid rehousing tends to be a really, really difficult program to implement. But I know some of those rapid rehousing programs are finally up and running, and they're finally spending large chunks of money getting folks housed. Also, because there's so much money being used still for hotels and motels and shelter, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat some ideas for resources or questions that you have that we can address, because likely the questions you have, a lot of other people have as well. So, and there's no such thing as a dumb question here. All right. Well, why don't we move on? Laura, if you don't mind starting there. All right, thank you. We're going to move on next to ESG, like eligible ESG-CV prepayment costs. So essentially, what are those costs that you can prepay in advance with ESG-CV funds? Next slide. All right, the first is, what type of costs ESG can be used to prepay. Some ideas are costs for shelter renovation. One of the latest AAQs that came out is that, this grantee was renovating a shelter. However, the renovation is going to last some time, and that it's not going to be fully completed by the September 30th deadline. So even if actual installation does not happen until after September, can we still use ESG-CV funds to pay for those costs? And the answer is yes. However, after September 30th, 2022, you can no longer use ESG-CV funds to pay for those renovation costs, including labor. You'll need to use another source of funds to finish out payment of the renovation. And then given that, HUD does expect that the renovation is going to be completed within a reasonable period of time. And then some of you may not realize that you can also prepay renter's insurance. The notice that came out last year introduced the flexibility of being able to use ESG-CV funds to pay for renter's insurance. I know that is a barrier for many of you previously when trying to house folks in your rapid rehousing programs. So yes, you can prepay renter's insurance only if a couple of things are in place that it has to be necessary to obtain or maintain housing, and that the landlord requires the renter to have renter's insurance to reside in the unit. And then one of the things that you have to also keep in mind is that the renter's insurance has to be paid directly to the insurance company on behalf of the program participant. It can't be something that you can pay to the landlord or to the client itself. And then if the person doesn't remain in the unit or doesn't remain an ESG-CV participant, no repayment is necessary. That's not something you have to worry about. Any questions about those? All right, next slide, please. All right, another thing many of you may not realize is that you can also use ESG-CV funds to pay for a full year of rent for a shelter, which is really exciting. This can be paid through September 30th, 2022 with ESG-CV funds, which is really wonderful because there is some guidance in the ESG interim rule that I've put here that as long as you're providing ESG-CV funds to a shelter, you have to provide shelter services and shelter to those households, at least for the period in which ESG-CV funds are provided, which may feel a little convoluted, but because of that language, you want to make sure that you can provide those services during that time. And so therefore you are allowed to pay for a full year of shelter rent up front. And then I just want to remind you all, because we still get this question a ton, that you cannot pay for rent up front in advance. Rent payments can only be provided as a one-time payment for arrears for up to 6 months. So that's only for arrears that you can pay for in advance. You can't pay for anyone else's rent. Just regular ongoing rent with ESG-CV funds in advance. However, that doesn't include first and last month's rent. Last month's rent, you can definitely pay up front if it's a part of their deposit. So that is considered exempt. But for, if a landlord asks like, yeah, we can house this person, but we're going to need 3-6 months of rent up front, unfortunately, you can't do that. I would encourage you instead to consider landlord incentives, which I think is a good alternative if they are requesting rent up front. Are there any questions about that? Or any questions about other costs that you're curious can be paid for up front?
So Natalie, there's a question in the chat, but it's not necessarily about advance payments. It's about what happens once ESG-CV sunsets and when we have to go back to using fair market rent as opposed to using rent reasonableness. And are there any steps like a waiver or such that can be done or applied to annual ESG? So I'm not sure if we have an answer to that, or if William wants to share any thoughts, but that's the question in the chat.
I personally don't have an answer to that. I do really appreciate you bringing up this question though, because right now I know that at HUD and within the TA community, we're definitely starting to work on how does that transition out of ESG-CV look like? What are some of the areas that we need to focus on? What are going to be some of the questions that we need to address when we do phase out ESG-CV? And that is definitely a great one. So that's something we can take back and make sure that we include in our internal discussion so you can have the appropriate guidance. William, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, FMRs is always complicated, right? We hear issues regardless of the context, COVID, no COVID, there's always issues on the FMR side. I don't know the process for getting reevaluations. I know that some COCs do it, not COCs, but I should say jurisdictions. And I know sometimes they succeed, it's not very often. Unfortunately, that's not something that the SNAP's office is involved with in any way. That's why we don't really know the process. It tends to be tied to our office policy development and research, PD&R, who publishes the FMR information. Now they do put out a notice by October every year. And in that notice, I believe there's information on how you can challenge FMRs. I believe that's actually the space where people do it. But I couldn't tell you anything beyond that in terms of how rigorous is that? What type of research are you going to do? I imagine it is not an easy process to get it changed, but it may be worth trying because we know that that rents and the FMR piece of it have a big part in how much we can do in communities.
Yep. Absolutely. I think it's really helpful to have that context on where these decisions are being made and what exactly the SNAP's office has control over and does not have control over. So thank you. Any other questions either about the prepayment cost eligibility or any questions outside of that? All right. Over to Aiden. Aiden Rich is from the Missouri Housing, and he's going to share with us all the secret sauce for why Missouri is so amazing and able to effectively spend all their ESG-CV funds.
Thank you, Natalie. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Awesome. So hi everyone, I am Aiden Rich. I am one of the supervisors for our HUD programs department at the Missouri Housing Development Commission. We are the sub-recipient from DSS for the non-entitlement award for the state of Missouri. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a little background, our total award for ESG-CV was a little over 28 million. CV1 was over 9 million, and then CV2 was over 18. We normally receive 2.5 to 3.5 million for annual ESG. So similar to, I assume, almost really every recipient, this was a huge bump up in funding. Definitely challenged our infrastructure. Additionally, the three largest COCs in our state, that being St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and Kansas City, all received their own funding and a significant bump in that as well. So we had to kind of limit how much we directed towards those areas. Our goal for allocation, and we've stuck pretty close to it, is 5% for each of them, and then 85% for the rest of the state. Next slide, please. So this shows our distribution of how we have used our ESG-CV funds. The blue portion of the big pie chart is our ERAP program, which I'll talk about a little bit later. That was a direct assistance program we did to get out rental arrears to people throughout the state. That was very highly effective, but we had to close down after only a few months because of the Treasury funds. And then the slightly larger portion, that's what we have subgranted to nonprofit to community action agencies throughout the state. ERAP was mainly homelessness prevention, but Obviously, your subgranting has a little bit more of a breakdown across components. So you can see the smaller pie chart shows that. Standard emergency shelter, which is what we just call normal emergency shelter, is obviously the biggest portion. That was pretty massive, followed by homelessness prevention and temporary emergency shelter. Combined, standard and temporary shelter took a little bit over 50% of our total awards to subgrantees. A lot of that was for hotel motel, but plenty for new shelters. Some people converting old hotels. We had a few of those old motels into new shelters, and then a lot of our existing shelters as well. Rapid rehousing, you can see, is a little under 10% of our award. We definitely pushed to get rapid rehousing up, especially when the new notice came out, to encourage people to not go into homelessness prevention if instead they could do rapid rehousing, because of the Treasury funds being out there for homelessness prevention. But as has been expressed, it is kind of difficult to get funding into that component. Street outreach is our lowest by far. Well, not necessarily by far, but lower than admin and HMIS, although that's mainly because the cost efficiency of a street outreach program, not necessarily the lack of clients being assisted with it. Next slide, please. So let's talk about that direct administration, the Emergency Rental Arrears Program, or ERAP. When the first notice came out and we saw that we could directly serve clients, we were very excited. We had never done it before, obviously, but really thought that we could do a good job with a centralized approach. So we made an online application that was open to the entire state in January of 2021. We received a lot of applications since we weren't just doing it for subgrantees, it was for any landlord in the state. So we actually had to contract a staffing agency to do application review and provide a lot of technical assistance. Landlords were the ones who we had apply on behalf of, but also in collaboration with their tenants. This way you could have a landlord who had multiple tenants behind in arrears do the same application for all of them, rather than each of them doing it individually and having a less coordinated request for funding. Follow the same rules as regular arrears, where it's a one-time payment of up to 6 months. This case was made directly to the landlords. The stipulation being that they could not evict anyone for that they got this arrears for at least 120 days, regardless of if it was a month of arrears or 6 months of arrears. This was especially important because the state of Missouri did not at any point enact an eviction moratorium. So when the national one fell, ours, there was none. And in many cases, the national one did not cover people. So instituting this was definitely very important to keep people in housing for at least another 6 months or 4 months. And then HMIS, we commissioned Institute for Community Alliances. They're an HMIS lead agency for 6 of our 8 COCs. They are in Des Moines and work in other states as well. They've done a pretty good job for us as an HMIS lead, and they had the capacity to take on running the HMIS for us. So we also spent a lot of HMIS money to have them basically do that on our end. Next slide. Although we love the Treasury funds, as the person tasked with spending ESG-CV funds, it was a little bittersweet when we had to close the ERAP program. However, it set up a really good foundation for our Treasury funds. We basically used, we created a website for ERAP that we then used for the ERA funds. We had to rename our ERA program SAFER, just to avoid confusion on the name. But we used a very similar application in the same portal and the same agency we contracted and all that. So although it was unfortunate that we had to, we couldn't keep using ESG-CV funds for that, for spending reasons, it made our ERA program start off pretty good because we were already basically doing a smaller version of that going into it. This is definitely the biggest thing in our spending. We spent almost 47% of our total allocation of 28 million within 3 to 4 months of this. At one point, we were putting out $1 million a week. It was incredible. People were applying, and we were able to just help so many people. And one of the things that was greatest about it was it could help people in areas that nonprofits or community action agencies didn't help. So it really was very good at getting out to rural communities. I mean, any landlord with an internet connection was able to do this. And we even actually integrated a paper application eventually, so internet wasn't even required. I will say it was a massive undertaking. We definitely could have used some more personnel, but it's kind of hard to hire someone for a 3 to 6 month stint just to do this. So it went on to my supervisors, Steve Whitson, Jenny Miller, did a fantastic job of working some 7-day weeks, 80-hour weeks, keeping this going, and we greatly appreciate that. Next slide, please. So the remainder of our funds, that went to sub-recipients. So we ran it very similar to how we run our annual ESG program, where they apply to us directly, and then we administer the funds out to them. We decided to start with a rolling application because when we got the notice in early September, late August, we turned around and created the CV program within essentially a month. While we were proud that we were able to do it that quickly, we understood a lot of the agencies wouldn't be able to read through the guidelines and create a proper application within a month or two. So we wanted to give everyone an opportunity by giving a 6-month window. But at the same time, the people who were ready to apply, we didn't want to stop them from getting funded quickly. So the rolling application, we would take anyone that came in at the end of the month, review them all, propose them to the board, and then get them funded. So we had grant agreements being executed as early as November, and then we had some that were being executed as late as April from the 6-month period. We actually capped initial disbursements to $200,000 or $250,000 per grantee, which was unique to ESG-CV. But we did allow them to apply for more, essentially just modify their original grant agreement to get additional funds after they spent their initial disbursement. So this wasn't necessarily to encourage quicker spending. What it was to encourage more frequent requests for reimbursements rather than spending the money and just waiting to ask for it from us. That way we could get a more accurate picture of how they were doing, how efficiently and effectively they were using the funds. And that's why we allowed reimbursement requests up to once per month, but we at least require every agency to submit once per quarter. And then another change we did was we strictly enforce spending deadlines with recapture and reallocation. For our annual ESG, if a 50% deadline passes and they miss it, we do a spending plan, we do technical assistance. In this instance, we did the same, but if they were far enough off, we would recapture and reallocate the funding midway through the grant period. This was just because we needed to move the funding to places where it was getting spent, because when the 50% deadline for us came around, which for us was October 1st, we had a lot of demand for funding from agencies that had plenty but could use more, and there were agencies who weren't spending, so we had to move it along. Next slide, please. So when HUD released the new notice, that was a game changer. We essentially had to do what we did last when they first opened with the original notice and just redo our program. The desk guide or program guidelines we have, 100-page document, had to be completely redrafted. All our forms changed, and we tried to do this in a month so we can get people who were already funded to be allowed to do these new expenses. But we also wanted to reopen the application so we can get more funding out. We knew recapture was coming up, so we wanted to use those reallocated funds for new agencies. And with these new eligible opportunities and the extension of the shelter deadline, we knew there'd be agencies who were not initially interested in ESG-CV funding that would definitely be interested now. This is especially where we tried to steer into rapid rehousing. At this point, agencies who spent homelessness prevention and were requesting modifications for more of that, we tried to limit. and say, because most of our agencies who do homelessness prevention also do rapid rehousing, we said we would like you to focus more on rapid rehousing if possible. Because we have so many funds that we're directly administering from another source for that purpose, whereas these could be used for rapid rehousing that is absolutely necessary. We weren't able to do it too great, unfortunately, as you saw at the pie chart, but we definitely try to get people into rapid rehousing. We kept these open until most funds were allocated, which was actually early in January. And then instead of continuing with the first come, first served basis of modification requests, where if you spend fully, you can request a new disbursement, we decided to just use a selection criteria to pick about 20 agencies and give all of them an opportunity to apply for a final disbursement of additional funds. That way, instead of taking that last 1.6 million and putting it between 7 agencies, we were able to split it between 20 all across the state. And so agencies who were going to spend all their award in the next month were not held back just because they were a month off. Next slide, please. So this comes to show our spending currently. Not only how much the total is how much that's been funded, and then the turquoise or greenish color, that's going to be how much hasn't been spent of that amount. As you can see, we're sitting at about 50% for everything. Rapid rehousing and standard emergency shelter, their spending looks a little bit worse more recently because we've reallocated a lot of funds towards that into modifications. And so even though those were very good spending percentages earlier, since we moved funds out of homelessness prevention, which is spending pretty poorly, and into rapid rehousing, that's why homelessness prevention looks like it's spending a lot better than it was. Then next slide. So some of the best practices or things we did, I would say number one by far is the direct assistance. You saw with the ERAP program how quickly we were able to spend. At this point, it's a little late in the game to integrate something like that, but there are plenty of other opportunities for direct assistance, and we've looked at some. But with how our nonprofits are doing, we decided against it. But as the actual state organization, we were able to do it much more efficiently than some of our sub-grantees. And there's plenty of still opportunities to open up programs like that for a few months and get some funding out to areas that might not be well covered by nonprofits or community action agencies. As far as the sub-grantee part, though, we did not let sub-recipients sit on funds. By this, once again, we do not mean that we encourage them to spend as quickly as possible, but there are plenty of agencies who would spend money and then they had enough capital on their own that they didn't have to request reimbursement every month. They could request it once per quarter. But then if that request got discarded, then they'd only request once per 2 quarters. And then, you know, we didn't have an accurate picture of how they were actually spending. So one thing we did is we didn't subgrant to city or county governments. We've done that in the past, but adding that extra step in the ladder just kind of slows down the process. And we found we just work better if we directly work with the subgrantees. As I mentioned earlier, we also enforce spending deadlines. We thought the jump from 20% to 80% in 6 months was going to be hard for some of our agencies. So we wanted to try to steer them towards higher than 20. So we put 50% for that time. And the majority of our agencies did hit it. Those that were really far off did get partially recaptured, but we were able to reallocate that about 2 million within the next month. We are holding the 80% deadline still at this time. And the 100% deadline, we actually put a month early, just so for those who don't hit it, we can quickly reallocate and recapture and ensure we do hit that 100% deadline. Limiting disbursements to encourage more frequent reimbursement requests was definitely a great move for our spending. And also a way to make sure that some agencies didn't just get $1 million off the gate. And then that way other agencies could have a chance at it too. And then allowing constant award amendments to adjust funding across components. Since this is way more than an annual period, we knew some agencies would definitely have shifts in what they were planning on doing and how much funding they needed. So we wanted to give them an opportunity to constantly adapt. Next slide, please. We also took on a lot of new sub-grantees, agencies we'd never worked with before. We would call them up and tell them, hey, we have this application open, here's information. Adapting to the updates from HUD, especially the new notice, but also constantly going to the office hours. Anytime that they had any presentation, these state office hours, we always attended to make sure we were up to date on stuff. Completely rewriting the desk guide, updating all forms after the notice was a huge undertaking, but very important and helped us get a lot more eligible activities and new agencies opportunities. And then I assume everyone is probably already doing this, but providing a lot of technical assistance. It's very important if you want to take on new agencies to set aside time for this. But even some of the ones we've worked with for years were just confused by ESG-CV's difference in rules, or instances where the rules weren't even different, but there was just a misconception. So that was another huge important thing we had that was able to ensure agencies could request reimbursement constantly. Next slide. So I left the Mo Housing Resources site we have. That is to show our SAFER program, or the ERA program, and our spending dashboard for ESG-CV and other funds. There is our own website, which is slightly not as attractive, but still a good resource. And then I've included my email as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Aiden. I mean, what struck me, I think, in your presentation is just how much work it is to manage these funds if you're going to be spending them out quickly, right? The amount of monitoring and movement of funds and distributing in small amounts and just constantly being on top of it to provide support, monitor, outreach, switch things around. It's a lot. Curious, and I know Amber asked this question in the chat, how many FTEs do you have that's working on ESG-CV at the state level? And then how many subrecipients do you have across the state? If you know.
Subrecipients, I don't know what FTE.
It sounds like it ebbs and flows a bit.
Yeah, it does. Subrecipients, probably 70.
Wow.
A few of them have multiple grants. Catholic Charities, for example, has 3. ICA, as an HMIS lead, has 6 because there's 1 per COC. But I'd say 60 to 70 subgrantees.
Amazing. And how many staff at the state level do you have working on ESG-CV?
So the ERAP program, we had multiple. There were like 4 really running it, and then we contracted out a lot of stuff. For the general administration of the sub-granting aspect, that was primarily me, with some assistance from my supervisor. The financial aspect, like the requesting reimbursement, we had 2 other staff members on. But as far as technical assistance, most of the compliance and all amendments, modifications, reviewing applications, that would generally fall on my shoulders.
Wow. Aiden, it sounds like you need a vacation.
Yeah, no time. No.
No time for vacation.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially the best practices portion. I found it very insightful. We are out of time. It is 11 a.m. Pacific, so I will end today's webinar. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Erica regarding, ESG-CV eligibility questions, contractor, TA, provider, and then as if you have any questions about Missouri's efforts to spend on ESG-CV and their best practices, please reach out to Aiden. And with that, and how do we sign up for these webinars? Please contact me directly, and I will put my email in the chat. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.